Welcome to the creative community. I'm your host, David Starkey, and my guest this time is artist and poet Linda Saccoccio. Linda, welcome.
Thank you, David. Nice to be here.
Yeah, nice to have you back again. It's
Thanks.
been probably, 10 years?
Yeah, it was 2011, actually.
Oh, wow, okay.
I looked it up. I was like,
12 years. So we're going to talk about some of your work. We're going to also hear some of your poems. But because it was such a long time ago, can you reacquaint readers a little bit, or viewers, with how you got started as an artist?
So I think that most artists, a lot of artists might say this, is that it's something that chooses you. You don't really choose it. It's something innate that you just find yourself doing. Plus, I had an aunt who was very creative, and she made sure I had art supplies from as soon as I could hold a crayon in my hand.
And where was this? Where'd you grow up?
Rhode Island.
Okay.
Yeah. So she was a single aunt, so she spent a lot of time at our house.
Was she an artist as well?
She was. She didn't do it as a profession because she had to make a living. But I know that sounds so.
Unlike me.
that reveals a lot. But she was always making and doing things, whether it was sculpting, painting, or crafting, building. Yeah.
And so you were doing it right alongside her?
Yeah, I was definitely aware of what was going on, and yeah, she was encouraging constantly.
Right.
Yeah.
Now, some parents they love it that their kids have an artistic bent, and others less so. How were your own parents?
It was difficult. It was, I mean, there was a mixed feeling. It was where I got a lot of praise, so it helped me, find some identity, I suppose.
Right.
But there was also fear that, in a conservative Italian household, like, you're going to be an artist, you're supposed to get married and have kids, and you can't do both, and but it seemed like a dangerous thing. Like, there was some fear in that for my mom especially, and my dad just didn't get it. It took him years before he came around.
Yeah. But I mean, you went off to the very prestigious Rhode Island School of Design, right? How did that happen?
Yeah, I applied without them knowing, and
oh, wow.
I had a brother-in-law who was good at photography, so he photoed my portfolio, and I got accepted, and my mom thought it was wonderful, but she didn't want me to go, and she has forgotten that because it's been a lot of a joy for her in the
Did she want you not to go to college at all?
No, she wanted me to go to college, to absolutely go to college.
But not to
an
art school.
An art school, and not to a private school when I could go to a less expensive school, state school, which had a good art department. And I knew this is where I had to be.
Well, yeah, I'm sure you had great instructors there.
Yeah, it was like coming home. It was one of those moments of, this feels really good,
Yeah. Well, that was a while back, but are there some lessons you learned there that you still retain and still incorporate into your work?
There's one teacher, Bryce Hobbs, who he touched in on my, again, innate, like, tendencies, maybe because it paralleled his.
Oh, okay.
So I had him as a drawing teacher, and then a winter session teacher, and he had us doing work on oatmeal paper. So I was painting oils on oatmeal paper, and it was all about just freedom and gesture and getting this quality of, I was painting cheese graters and meat grinders and like simple objects, but they had, this cheese grater was the kind with the wheel that you spin, and it had 3 legs. So it's kind of animated in a sense. And I put them up on the wall, and he was talking to another teacher, and he's like, it's just when you lose yourself in a work, and there's no separation.
Wow, that's great.
Yeah,
that's high praise.
yeah, it was really amazing to work with him. It's just every once in a while you get that one teacher that resonates.
Well, now I'm not an artist, so what is oatmeal paper, and what does it do? How does it respond to paint?
I assume he had us doing it maybe because, one, it's not precious, you know,
Oh, okay.
it's cheap, and we'd get a sheet and just tear it into 4.
Okay.
And
you could feel like you could experiment, and it wasn't
Exactly.
the end of the world if it went wrong.
Exactly,
Yeah.
yeah. And it absorbed nicely, and then it built nicely. Yeah, it had some substance. It was rough,
Right.
you know.
Now, then you were at the School of the Visual Arts in New York, is that right?
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
Was that like an immediate transition, or did you have a
No,
little time?
so what happened was living at home was a little tricky, and I talked to a teacher at RISD who was from Rhode Island, and I said, I'm trying to decide whether to switch out of illustration to painting or go to Rome on the European Honors Program. And he said, go away. You don't need to go away. So I did. And that year changed my whole life.
Right.
It was like, what after this? You
Right,
know?
right.
So it left me in an interesting place. And I ended up in Boston with my future husband. We both met in Rome.
Oh,
Barry
wow.
was on the European Honors Program as well.
Wow.
Yeah, so we lived in Boston, and I started taking classes at the museum school.
Mm-hmm.
And there I worked on a portfolio with a teacher. They weren't abstract paintings yet, but they were...
And we're going to see abstraction mostly when we
Yeah,
look at your work.
yeah.
Yeah.
These were psychological paintings of struggles in my life of people that I knew. So they were
No
very
names
different.
here.
No names today.
Right.
that phase is over. So from there I went. We actually moved to Providence for 2 years, and then it was New York City.
Mm-hmm.
So I went to School of Visual Arts.
Right.
Yeah.
So you got an MFA.
Yeah.
How did you find yourself out here on the California coast?
It was something I always wanted to do, but we didn't do it. And then I was meeting a lot of people in New York City from California, and they had this glow, and I'm like, I want that.
Right.
And I was into yoga, and I trained as a yoga teacher, so I met teachers that were from here.
From Santa Barbara.
Yeah, Sherry Clampett actually said, come, we do yoga with the windows open, you know. So Barry was doing work here, architectural work, so I told him I wanted to come on his next business trip, and that's all it took.
Yeah. And so you've been here ever since.
Yeah,
And that was in the early 2000s?
Yep.
Right.
So we moved here 2003.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well,
Big shift.
yeah, and that's quite a story and an impressive pedigree. Let's take a look at people been wondering what does their work look like. Let's take a look, and you can kind of walk us through some of these images and tell us the titles and what you were thinking, what you were trying to achieve, and so forth.
Yeah. So these are all based on poems. So I've found that tricking myself in a sense by getting into a poem. I'll read a bunch of poems and then I'll find one that resonates with me.
Oh, okay.
You know, so it touches upon my experiences as well, which I guess that's normal. And
Sure,
you know, and then it triggers enough emotion and feeling that I can start. And sometimes I'll use the colors that I read in the poems or just the feelings. So this one is visual, a visual symbiosis of the poem Bioluminescence by Paul Tran.
Oh, wow.
So I just flipped through his book and was reading, and that's what I came up with. So I guess it has a feeling of bioluminescence.
Yeah, it does. I was going to say, I mean, it's not clearly an illustration of a moment in the poem, but that you're not exactly looking for that either.
No, I'm not, and that's exactly true. I'm not illustrating it. It's kind of working with ekphrasis in a way, but also, I guess, what's that word where your senses mingle?
Synergy? No, not synergism, no.
It's with a K, I believe. I just read it this morning because
it'll come back
It'll
to
come
us in the last minute of the show.
Yeah, so I think that's what's going on. Whatever that is, it's where the
that's what's
senses
happening
mingle. Yeah, so. And this one is just After For Memory by Adrienne Rich.
Ah, okay. Now,
Yeah.
what is that poem about?
I don't remember, and I didn't bring the poems because I thought that would be too much
too close.
to read.
But is there a sense of, is it purely abstract? Because I can almost see houses there at the bottom or something like that.
You know, sometimes I'll interpret, so kind of the way early abstraction started, just breaking things up. So a gesture to imply something rather than really draw it, you know.
That makes sense.
So that gives me an opportunity to not always be making like the same type of lines. So I'm making, you know, hard lines, straight lines in this one, you know. And that one is after Axel in Thunder by Adrian Rich. And a lot of times I listen to music by Olafur Arnalds when I paint or something like that, just to keep the energy in a good place and keep me going.
Right.
You know,
so you're getting music and poetry, and we're getting something as gorgeous as this.
Yeah.
And one of the things I love about your work is there's a sense of simplicity, but it's not simple. You know what I mean? It's all coheres, and yet, you know, it doesn't feel overly busy.
Oh, that's good. Yeah. I wondered, because sometimes I'm like, why can't I make it more simple?
Yeah, no. I think even this one, which has quite a lot of color and movement, is still very much in that, keeping with that.
Yeah. I just,
one.
you know, start with the strokes. You know, the strokes and the energy in the stroke matters a lot to me.
Right.
You know, and this one, abstract response to lecture on something by John Cage, and there's also another section of his thoughts on page 192, lectures and writings of John Cage in the book Silence.
Okay. And I can see that John Cage is a very avant-garde writer. This is probably more coherent than his.
Yeah, and you know what? No, I'm glad you put it that way, because I like I started doing this with either dreams or fragment. People who just did sort of fragment poems, like B.P. Nichol and another, I forget what his name. But anyway, it's just enough that it doesn't get me into a complete story. It just, there's just enough to
it opens the door,
Right.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Let's look at one more, and then I'd love to hear a poem or two from you, Linda.
Sure. And this is Meditation on number 842 by Emily Dickinson. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's great.
And sometimes when I'm doing it, I sort of, is this going to come together? You know, I don't know till it's done.
And when do you get that feeling that it's done? Is there a certain...
Well, these are gouache and watercolor. And the way I've been doing them is less about painting over and more about painting adjacent to. Sort of respecting the line and trying to keep a certain variety of line in there and size of brush and stuff. So it's just when the page is filled, that's it.
That's it. It's done.
It's not like oils where you can go back.
You can go over and over and over.
Yeah.
Well, let's hear a poem or two by you. And as you're pulling the poems out, maybe you could talk a little bit about any relationship between painting poems and writing them. Yeah.
Okay, sure. So this one is What Value This Day. Sometimes, some days, bump up against habits. Long worn need to go out on trash day. Old habits tattered, moth eaten. Poor excuses for thriving, potentially surviving. Sometimes, some days, habits tie your ankles together when they should gag your mouth, vile venom. Spewed on contact with frustration, damage to new carpet, puppy pulls to taste fallen dough that doesn't cooperate. Pressure to succeed, biscuits, shortbread, half failure but will serve. Sometimes, some days you give what you can, but you bump up against others. No patience for minutia, rant, complain, waste words. No room for this while baking, for a friend and tea tomorrow. Thoughts almost kill fragrance, biscuits that mostly fail to be all they could have been, if only there was better guidance, experience, less distractions. Some days are okay, but not satisfying, frayed with loss.
So that poem zooms all over the place from one idea and thought and image to the next, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Is that at all like this
Yeah,
rendition of the inspiration by Emily Dickinson?
Yeah, it must be. I mean, the poems, I guess, I feel like I'm in a trance when I'm working, a certain trance, and I allow something to come in and work with me.
Right.
And so the same happens with poems and paintings. And I don't mind turning things upside down, like having, you know, the sky be on the ground and the earth, you know, just, and I think in poems too, I guess I'm challenging our sense of reality, you know, by doing that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, and that's a fascinating. Let's go back to the see a few more paintings, and then we'll pull another poem up for me. We got about 12 minutes left, so we're we're going at a pretty good clip. What's this one?
This one is after the poem Sakula Speaks in Songs of the Sons and Daughters of Buddha. And it was translated by Anne Waldman, and for some reason I don't have the man's name. I've done some Buddhist work, and so I have a background in that. And
that Buddhist sense of you do it once and that it's
right.
done, and it works really well with this watercolor that you're doing.
Right,
Yeah.
exactly. Right, and that's what I strive for, to get like that real potency of the stroke and the color. Yeah. And this one, so these are done on a paper similar to the oatmeal paper. This is a stained antique paper, and it gives a different effect because it's already got a color on the ground.
Right.
Echoes from a poem by Frank O'Hara, Rivers. So rivers are kind of...
Yeah, you can sort of see an echo of rivers there, for sure.
It feels...
But also, again, you know, they're going straight up and straight down.
Right.
That sense of imbalance or just feeling a little off kilter.
Yeah.
I think that's really, really neat.
Yeah. It must be my childhood. Like, there was so much, like, really strict control that I'm like...
You're like, forget it, yeah.
Sonnets, Frank Sonnets, Diane Seuss. It's page 12. She didn't title them, so whatever that was.
Right.
Yeah. And abstraction by a poem by Akhmatova in a book called Akhmatova, so there was no title again. And then Cloud Sky by Nakahara Chuya. And if you want to, this is a young poet I met in Europa, Andy Riley, and his poem from his book Sun Buckets, The Day Before I Left.
Oh, that's gorgeous.
Thanks. And these are on Yupo. There's two of them. This is rooted in a Tanka poem, River of Stars, selected poems of Yosano Akiki. And it's heavy Yupo, which has a sheen to it. So the paint sort of slips, and you have to kind of wait before you can touch it.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. And also on Yupo, Turtle Island poem number 3 by Dan Tola Papa McMillan in Coconut Milk.
Yeah. We're going to pause on that one, I think, because the next group is going to go to
Greece,
your Greece residency. But let's hear another poem in the interim.
Here we'll do a short one.
That.
Daylight savings time. It's after 11 p.m. on a day stretched by twirling the clock's hands ahead. A wave to urge the winter to rest. Encourage our spring bulbs aspry. Afternoon sun to dry clothing, lest fog rolls into landscape from Pacific blue. Gather up all your glad, sad rags as sun caked by clouds, rolling fog is hidden. Begins to dampen almost dry tops, bottoms, undergarments. Wind tosses lighter ones like a child on a swing, jumping off like the big kids, land flat on neutral ground, half-baked, bewildered.
And that one definitely has a more imagistic feel to it, even though it's still kind of moving out in lots of different directions. But it clearly evokes a sense of time and place.
Right.
And,
so it
and
starts
weather.
in the yard, and then it goes into my memory, I suppose. Right. Yeah.
That's nice.
Thanks.
Well, so we're going to look at you. Recently, we're in Kefalonia in Greece at the Ionian
Center for Arts and Culture.
Center for Arts and Culture. Congratulations
Thanks.
on this residency.
Yeah,
I was talking to you about first being on the show. You were actually there in Greece. So tell us a little bit about the experience of the residency, and then we can talk about the work as well.
Yeah, I think, it was kind of chaotic. There was a lot of figuring it out, what is this and what can we do here? It was, there were 2 artists that stayed about a week and a half while I was there, and then when I arrived was a dancer, and there was a poet who had been there before. A month.
Okay.
So the dancer and I were there for the full month of May. And so it really was trying to figure out what the opportunity was. And in the end, I can think that, when you have someone doing your laundry, cooking your meals.
That's the opportunity.
It really makes a huge difference.
Right.
Even though there was a lot of chaos that I had to navigate to get to work.
What in terms of the traffic, the people?
The people. Yeah, it was they didn't really have proper studios, so that was one element.
Right.
And
so where were you painting?
I ended up in this so-called villa space, which was a very nice apartment that had a living room. And since I was the only one there at that time.
That living room was your studio?
Exactly.
Yeah.
It was perfect. These French doors, it was lovely.
Yeah. What are we looking at here?
So to get going, I started by drawing. I draw in colored pencil, often to poems as well, but this time I went out into the neighborhoods, and there was a Mycenaean gravesite that I drew at. There was a field where I had seen a flock of sheep one day. So I just kind of planted myself out there and let the lines roll. And I like to draw a lot, so there's a nice freedom and change of medium that's really a pleasure.
Right.
And this was the first painting I did there. This one is after a poem. I decided to shift to Greek poems. Why not,
makes sense,
right?
Yeah.
So this was Angelos Sicilianos' version of The Horses of Achilles. And this is on hot pressed paper, which I found I like a lot.
Wow.
I bought it via Athens, and I did this after a swim in the Ionian Sea. So I felt like it all came together.
Well, one of the things that people who go to Greece talk about is the light, right? I mean, so that clearly has an effect there.
Yeah.
How did it change the way that you approached your painting?
It was cloudy and cool the first few weeks, but then it got progressively nicer.
Right, yeah.
And the light we were up on a hill too, so it just felt really different. It's very similar to Santa Barbara in a weird way, but very different at the same time. So I would say the light and the water, just the watercolor is amazing, and the flow and the feel of it, Synesthesia was the word.
Synesthesia.
All I needed was
I said synergy. I was on the right track.
You were. Okay, so here we go. Forgetfulness by Maria Polydoros. That's the poem.
And that almost looks like a landscape.
Yeah, I know. I always wonder what I'm doing when that happens. Like, is that okay?
Yeah, it's okay. I think it's okay. I think it looks really great.
Thanks.
Let's see what we got there.
I was using the paints more watery, which I liked a lot too, and that may relate again to the water. Strophe by George Safaris, contemporary Greek poet.
Very famous poet, yeah.
Yeah. And that's the Ionian Center up on the hill. It's a really nice building, actually.
No studios, but a great
no studios, but a great gallery. That space, I got to show my work in that space. I had a one-person show that I hung myself, and so it was nice to have that.
Cool. Yeah, absolutely. And then you were also involved in a theater production, I think, of Next
Right,
Generation
and it
Theater.
was partially because of Narissa, who was a dancer. She's a young dancer just out of college, and she lined up the theater. So there were 3 residents at the time, a poet and myself and Narissa. And so we got to perform in front of a Greek audience, small one, but you
Right.
know. So that's the banner in front that we
And she was dancing while you were painting, or were your paintings in the background? Or?
So we had it planned where Nicholas would read his poems,
Right.
then Narissa would dance to a recording of Sophie, the director's conversation, and then I would, I had projection like this,
Right.
and read poems and talked about my
Gotcha.
work. And then the last scene was supposed to be me reading a poem while Narissa danced, Nicholas, and go back and forth like that.
Right.
That kind of got eclipsed, so we got to do it the night of my opening at the center, because there was things are chaotic. So the tech man there said, if you're not flexible in Greece, you'll die. So,
You learned a good lesson, yeah.
yeah.
Well, we just have 2 minutes left, and I'd love to hear you give some advice to people who are writing poetry and also, are interested in painting. So, like,
Yeah.
what are some of the tidbits that you've really kind of stayed with you that you would pass on to other folks?
So the tech guy at the theater said something to us. He said, because we weren't from there and not many people may come to your show.
Right.
And he said, but you do your art for yourself.
Right.
And I was like, wow, it's so simple,
Right.
and I think that's key. Anytime you do your creative work, you have no idea who it's going to touch and how it's going to go. So I think you really have to find out who you are and trust what comes up. It's a constant battle of trusting, your own voice, your own talents,
Right.
because it is, for me, it feels so ethereal. Maybe again, against my childhood, which was so concrete,
Right.
But
Well, and that's great advice. Again, it doesn't matter if it's 1,000 people. If it's one person, then you've made that connection.
right. And as long as you're connecting with it as well, then that's really, you have to really hold on to that.
Yeah, yeah, that's great advice.
Yeah.
Anything in my last 20 seconds? one sentence or two?
Find your people too. I think that's really important, to have some kind of camaraderie in the creative fields. That it makes you feel less alone and less odd.
Yeah.
If you can, people who are doing the same type of work or different, but as long as it's a creative community.
That is a perfect note for us to end on. Linda, thank you so much for being on the show.
Thank you, David. It's always a pleasure. Yeah.
The Creative Community is a co-production of TVSB in Santa Barbara and CAPS Media in Ventura. I'm your host, David Starkey, and we'll see you next time.